My name is Sarah, and I used to love parks. There was something magical about the fresh air, the sound of birds singing, and the feel of the grass under my feet. But now, parks make my heart race for all the wrong reasons. This is my story, and I hope telling it will help me make sense of what happened. It all began on a crisp autumn evening. The leaves were turning shades of orange and red, falling gently to the ground like nature's own confetti. I had just moved to a small town called Willow Creek, nestled between sprawling forests and gentle hills. Everyone told me the park in the middle of town was the crown jewel. "It's so peaceful," Mrs. Miller, my elderly neighbor, had said. "You'll love it there." That evening, I decided to take her advice. I grabbed my jacket and headed out just as the sun began to set. The golden light bathed everything in warmth, and the park looked straight out of a postcard. The entrance was marked by a wooden arch with the words Willow Park carved into it. Beyond it lay a winding path surrounded by towering trees. The air smelled of earth and decaying leaves, the kind of smell that makes you think of cozy fireplaces and warm drinks. At first, it was everything I hoped it would be. Children played on swings, their laughter echoing through the trees. Couples strolled hand in hand, and joggers passed by with friendly nods. But as the sun dipped lower, a strange feeling crept over me. The park seemed quieter. The laughter faded, the joggers disappeared, and even the wind stopped rustling the leaves. I looked around, realizing I was alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the vast silence. No answer. I told myself not to panic. People must have left because it was getting dark, I reasoned. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I decided to head back to the entrance, but as I turned around, I noticed something strange. The path looked different. Where there should have been a clear trail leading back to the arch, there was now only dense underbrush. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting like gnarled hands. My heart started to race. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but the screen was blank. No signal, no light, nothing. "This isn't funny," I said out loud, hoping someone would jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But the silence only deepened. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves, coming from behind me. The footsteps came closer, deliberate and slow, crunching over the brittle leaves scattered across the ground. Each step made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My instinct screamed to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It pressed in, suffocating and unnatural, as though the park itself held its breath. For a moment, I considered calling out again, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about the air had changed. It felt thicker, heavier, like the weight of countless unseen eyes pressing down on me. The dim light of dusk quickly gave way to shadows that stretched and warped, distorting the familiar shapes of trees into grotesque figures. The path, once clear, had entirely vanished. I spun in place, looking for any sign of an opening, but the towering trees now formed an impenetrable wall around me. I told myself to focus. Panicking wouldn't help. I took a deep breath and began walking in what I hoped was the right direction. Every step felt labored, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The faint crunch of leaves behind me returned, matching my own hesitant pace. I stopped. The sound stopped. I started again, walking faster this time, and the crunching behind me sped up to match. The realization hit me like ice water. I wasn't alone. Desperation clawed at me as I broke into a run. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears. The trees blurred past, their branches clawing at me as I pushed through the underbrush. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, closer. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I tumbled down a small slope, the world spinning around me until I landed hard on my side. Pain shot through my arm, but I forced myself up, ignoring the throbbing ache. The footsteps had stopped again, but I could feel something. I wasn't sure how to describe it. A presence, a weight. It felt like standing in the shadow of a massive predator, its breath hot on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, half expecting to see glowing eyes or jagged teeth in the darkness. But there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. The quiet returned, more oppressive than ever. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took a cautious step forward. The forest seemed to watch me, the trees leaning in as if to whisper secrets I couldn't hear. Then, far in the distance, I saw a faint light. Relief flooded through me. Maybe it was a house or another person with a flashlight. Whatever it was hope. I stumbled toward the light, each step feeling like a battle against the weight of exhaustion and fear. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, illuminating a small clearing ahead. But the relief turned to dread when I reached it. In the center of the clearing stood a lamppost. It was old and rusted, the glass around the bulb cracked and smeared with something dark. The light flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows across the ground. Beneath it was a bench, and on that bench lay something that made my stomach churn. A coat. It was folded neatly, almost too neatly, as if placed there deliberately. It looked old and worn, the fabric frayed and stained. But what truly terrified me was that it was mine, the exact same coat I was wearing. I stared at it, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. My hands instinctively reached for the coat on my body, feeling the rough fabric still clinging to me. How could it be in two places at once? A low sound broke the silence. It was soft at first, like a distant hum, but it quickly grew into a deep, guttural growl. The air around me seemed to vibrate with it, and I realized the sound wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere. I backed away from the lamppost, my eyes darting to the shadows that encircled the clearing. They seemed to shift and ripple, as though something just beyond my vision was moving through them. Then, I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, its movements slow and deliberate. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its face, if you could call it that, was a blank expanse of pale skin, devoid of features. Yet, somehow, I knew it was looking at me. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I hit the ground hard, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the figure. It took a step closer, its movements unnervingly silent despite the crunch of leaves underfoot. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my only thought to get away. The trees seemed to close in tighter around me, their branches snagging at my clothes like desperate hands. The growling sound grew louder, echoing through the forest as if the very ground beneath me was alive and angry. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. The thing was behind me. I didn't need to look to know. I could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing against my back. The path was circular, looping back on itself in an endless curve. No matter how far I ran, I kept ending up in the same spot. The lamppost and the bench were always just ahead, no matter how fast or how far I went. Panic consumed me. I screamed, the sound tearing through my throat, but it felt like the park swallowed my voice. There was no echo, no response, only silence. Then, the figure appeared again. This time, it wasn't alone. The figure wasn't alone anymore. More shapes emerged from the darkness, sliding out from behind the trees. They moved differently, some slow and hesitant, others jerky and erratic. Their forms were indistinct, as though the shadows themselves had come alive and taken shape. Each figure was unnerving in its own way. Some were tall and stretched unnaturally, their limbs too long to belong to anything human. Others were hunched and twisted, dragging themselves forward on hands and knees. One had a face, if you could call it that, a grotesque mask of features that seemed to melt and reform with every passing second. They surrounded the clearing, their eyeless gazes fixed on me. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed up slowly, my mind racing for an escape plan. There was none. The only thing behind me was the lamppost, the faint flickering light casting trembling shadows over the grotesque figures closing in. Then they started to move. The tall ones bent down as if trying to get a closer look at me, their movements unnervingly slow and deliberate. The hunched ones crept forward, their hands clawing at the ground with a sound like nails scraping against stone. The others simply stood there, watching, waiting. I clutched at my sides, trying to steady my breathing, but the panic was overwhelming. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The circle around me tightened, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I turned and bolted. I ran straight into the forest, away from the clearing and the creatures. The branches tore at my skin and clothes, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and them. The forest seemed endless. No matter how far I ran, it all looked the same: twisting trees, tangled roots, and endless shadows. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I stumbled onto another path, this one barely visible under layers of fallen leaves. I paused to catch my breath, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, I heard it again, the crunch of leaves. It was distant at first, but it grew louder with every passing second. I didn't dare look back. Instead, I followed the path, hoping it would lead me somewhere, anywhere, safe. The path twisted and turned in ways that made no sense. Sometimes it felt like I was doubling back on myself, and other times it seemed to stretch on forever. The forest around me grew darker, the trees so dense they blocked out even the faintest sliver of moonlight. That's when I saw the cabin. It was small and run down, barely more than a shack, but it was shelter. The windows were dark, and the wooden door hung slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the wind. I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen told me not to go inside, but the sound of the footsteps was getting closer. I didn't have a choice. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, closing it behind me as quietly as I could. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside, dusty furniture, cobwebs in every corner, and the faint smell of mildew, but at least it was a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I moved to the window, peering out through a crack in the filthy glass. The forest outside was still, the shadows motionless. For a brief, fragile moment, I allowed myself to believe I was safe. Then I heard the knocking. It was soft at first, almost polite, as though someone was simply asking to be let in. It came from the door, just a few feet behind me. My blood turned to ice. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was steady and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. I didn't dare move. I held my breath, praying whoever or whatever it was would go away. But the knocking didn't stop. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room for anything I could use as a weapon. There was an old, rusted fireplace poker leaning against the wall. I grabbed it, the metal cold and heavy in my hands. The knocking grew louder. Knock, knock, knock. The door rattled in its frame, the wood creaking under the pressure. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen, the poker clutched tightly in my hands, staring at the door. A low whisper broke the quiet. "Let me in." The voice was soft and sing-song, almost childlike, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Let me in," it repeated, more insistent this time. The door began to creak open, slowly, inch by inch. I didn't wait to see what was on the other side. I turned and ran deeper into the cabin, finding a narrow staircase that led to a basement. I scrambled down the steps, my feet slipping on the dusty wooden planks. The basement was pitch black, but I didn't care. I pressed myself into a corner, gripping the poker like a lifeline. Upstairs, the door slammed open. Heavy footsteps echoed through the cabin, slow and deliberate. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they moved from room to room. "Let me in," the voice called again, though it was no longer coming from upstairs. It was in the basement with me. The voice whispered again, closer this time. "Let me in." My breath hitched. The basement was pitch black, but I could feel the presence there, lurking in the darkness. The weight of it pressed against my chest, making it almost impossible to breathe. I gripped the rusted poker tighter, the metal biting into my palms. The footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, circling the room. Dust swirled in the stale air, and I could hear the faint creak of the old wooden beams above me. My heart hammered in my chest as I pressed myself further into the corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. "Why are you hiding?" the voice crooned, sweet and mocking. "Don't you want to see me?" I bit down hard on my lip, desperate not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. It was subtle at first, a faint rustle, like fabric brushing against the stone walls. Then it grew louder, closer, until it was directly in front of me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the suffocating darkness. Then, my fingers brushed against something different.